what it means to enjoy white privilege. Now, that's not something that Caucasians are typically used to thinking about, especially in Utah. The fact that a Caucasian would enjoy a level of privilege, if only because the African American population is so small. So it's easy to convince ourselves that it's a non-issue. But here's what it really ends up looking like. Caucasians feel entitled to define what is and is not racist. We like to think that, okay, this is what racism is supposed to look like. My grandfather, yeah, he was a nice guy, and he said some things, but he wasn't racist because I loved my grandfather. Now, one thing you need to understand about the Stevenson family is we love ourselves. All right, Stevensons are enamored with their past, their present, their future. I am fully convinced that if Stevensons were offered the opportunity to found a country of their own, they would jump at the chance. And we have a national anthem ready to go. So I grew up in a culture in which we were more than proud to invite people to our family reunions because we were just that good. Right? Come along and be a part of the Stevenson empire. But there was something of a dark underbelly to the Stevenson experience, and many of you may have had this this similar experience in that we had a relative who entertained certain racial insensitivities. It was no secret. We all knew exactly what he believed about minority races, in particular African Americans. And on one occasion, a good man in our family, a man who was of high stature, we all respected him, he made some comments about this relative who entertained these racial sensibilities. Now, let me make it clear, we all held this relative in the highest regard. He was a well-respected man. His children turned out fantastically. He worked his fingers to the bone trying to provide for his family. He was the sort of person that we would often say tributes about in testimony meetings and in family gatherings. But one time, during one of our great family reunions, I heard the comment made by the relative that I mentioned that this racism was indefensible. It was inexcusable. There was no way to explain it away. There was no reason to sympathize with it. There was no reason to excuse it. There was no reason to try to negotiate it or engage in apologia. It was indefensible. And the man who was saying this, he was no heretic. He was no left-wing radical who was trying to fundamentally change the structure of the church. He would never have called himself an activist. In fact, he was probably the best connected to the church hierarchy out of everyone in our family, and he had held several high-level positions within the church. So when I heard him say that about such a good man within our family, I asked myself a hard question. How could a man who is so good, so respected, so loved, be so wrong about something so important?
Hello brothers and sisters, I hope that you're doing fine very well. Today this represents Index Stories and yet with another video. Now there's something that I want to talk about. The question of white privilege. And sometimes, in as much as we ourselves, we discuss about the white privilege, we discussed about the oppressions that the palm-colored people have done to brown people, So having to discuss these things has made us understand some things. And sometimes we feel like we educate each other about racism, colorism, and, bigotry, fascism, all of those things. But the people who are benefiting from these systems are not getting this information. So it's important for us to have a group of people that can talk to these people, that can tell them that indeed what you're doing is wrong. The worst thing that we can do, or the worst thing that the world can do, is to is keeping quiet. You can't keep quiet while everything is not okay. So there is this white preacher who goes on and talks about white privilege, and he says something important. Caucasians feel entitled to define what's not racism and what is racism. To their face, they can decide to say that's not racism, that's something different. This is racism, So I want us to watch this video. It's going to show us how this white preacher himself, he tries to call his people out and tell them and to choose the right path, something that people need to know or something that people need to do. And it shouldn't be that people have to go to church to discuss about these things. This is something that should be, if you're a person who has humanity in yourself, because there's some things that you do to other folks, especially brown folks, because we know that the systems are placed to make brown people that look like me to, face a number of problems in the United States. So I want us to watch this video. As you know, I'll be back with my commentary. I just want to let you know to tell me what you think about the video after watching the video, and I'll also ask you to like, subscribe. You can also share this video with somebody else that might wanna hear this thing. And I have my Cash App account on my bio. If you wish that you want to support me, or if you want to buy me a coffee, I'll most definitely appreciate, only if you are able to do so. So let's get right into the video. I'll be back with my commentary. As you know, these are presented unique stories. If you're watching this video for the first time, you know what to do. Until then, let's dive right into the video.
And this was a question that loomed over all of us. We all had to grapple with this relative's racism from an early day. And it's noteworthy, too, that at one point, he was taking a trip to Missouri, and as you will see, Missouri is symbolically significant in the history of race and Mormonism. On his way to Missouri, a relative said, "So, would you ever want your descendants to entertain the views that you now entertain? Would you want them to pass that on?" And he said, "No, I would not. This ends with me." So the idea that a person, or might even add an institution, could have tremendous potential, but even at the same time have an Achilles heel, have a deep and abiding weakness, that wasn't new to me. And ultimately, that's what propelled me down this path of research, to understand the Latter-day Saints' tortured and difficult history with those of African descent. This presentation will be divided into three parts. First, we're going to talk about the history. We're going to get into the documents. We're not going to be talking about theories. We're not going to talk about hypotheses. We're going to talk about what the documents actually say. Secondly, we're going to be talking about the theology of it. How can we understand prophethood? How can we understand a covenant people? And how can we understand racism within the context of what the gospel teaches us? And finally, we will close with praxis. What does this mean? How can we apply this knowledge in our everyday interactions with not only those of the African American race, but also fellow white members of the church? First, history. We, of course, have to start with Joseph Smith among the saints. Now, it's worth noting, and this is a scripture that you all know, that the earliest revelation on how we should treat those of other ethnicities, it was in 1830. And none other than the Book of Mormon. All are alike unto God, both black and white, bond and free. How did this teaching manifest itself within the Latter-day Saint community? So when Joseph Smith founded the church, as we would learn, there was, and I quote, "no special rule," unquote, as pertains to those of African descent within the church. But the same year that Joseph Smith founded the LDS Church is also the year that a famous abolitionist, William Lloyd Garrison, founded his newspaper in Boston, committed to the abolition of slavery in the United States. Now, that should tell you how hot of a topic slavery and race was in America at that time. And it's tempting and easy for us as 21st century Americans to conflate abolitionism with being anti-slavery. And that distinction is important if you want to understand the early days of Mormonism and slavery, because they're very different strains of thought. It's one thing to be anti-slavery, but it's quite another to be an abolitionist. So when Joseph Smith released the Book of Mormon, and it's clear that there was to be no exclusionary rule as pertains to those of African descent, at least among most Latter-day Saints, it met with some ambivalence. There were some Southerners amongst the Latter-day Saint community, and they had a certain amount of unease when it came to their interactions with African Americans. But one thing that they accepted was that the Book of Mormon was, in fact, the Word of God, so they were willing to go with it. And they were willing to respect what Joseph Smith had revealed to them. But there was a problem. You see, even though it was one thing to be anti-slavery and it was another to be an abolitionist, that distinction wasn't always easily discerned amongst those who consider themselves to be pro-slavery. If you were against slavery, then you wanted to end the slave trade immediately. That's what it meant to be an abolitionist. You didn't just want to end it gradually. You just didn't want it to fade away or hope that God would intervene at some point. Being an abolitionist meant that you ended it today, now. No compromises. You don't negotiate with evil. You don't negotiate with the evil slave empire. You end it today. And that was the equivalent of being what we would see as today as an Islamic fundamentalist, terrorist. That was a kind of radical thought that people tended to project onto abolitionists. Abolitionists were often associated with slave uprisings. They were the kinds of people who supposedly would sneak into slave communities and whisper words into the slaves' ears. And before you know it, you have a number of African Americans rioting in the streets and killing white people. This was the kind of discourse that surrounded abolitionists. So in 1831, the Saints moved to Missouri, which, as many of us know, was at the time a slave state. And there not being any special rule as pertains to African Americans, the Latter-day Saints were at least somewhat open to the idea of African Americans joining the Saints in western Missouri, but local forces didn't see it that way. And when they caught wind that the local Latter-day Saints were as at least open to African Americans as they claimed, it became the pretext for mob action. And when the Saints were ousted from Jackson County in 1833, that was on the short list of the causes. And there were other issues as well. The Latter-day Saints were saying some really overly kind things in the eyes of Missourians about the Native Americans, how they're a promised people, and how Missouri is the promised land and that sort of thing. But when it came to African Americans, they said, before you know it, these Mormons are going to be bringing African Americans into the area, and they're going to be marrying them, and they're going to be having offspring. And is this really the kind of society that we want to have amongst our people? The Saints are kicked out of Jackson County. And this issue of race would be a specter, a ghost, that would haunt the Latter-day Saints for several years to come. And Joseph Smith knew it. And he knew that at all costs, he needed to distance himself from the label of abolitionist. He couldn't be seen as somebody who wanted to end the slavery immediately. He couldn't be seen as somebody who might be winking at interracial marriage. So say whatever it takes, because the cost could be mob action if he failed to do so. So in 1836, April to be exact, and that month is significant. Joseph Smith releases a statement in the Messenger and Advocate, and in it he endorses slavery as something that is divinely inspired, and in fact it was a great protective agent for the Caucasian community. After all, he said, do we want these degraded people coming into our society and associating with our women? No, we don't. Again, this was all in an effort to deflect what was happening in Missouri. He could not run the risk of being called an abolitionist. In fact, Governor Daniel Dunklin, then the Missouri governor, sent a letter to W.W. Phelps and said, Mr. Phelps, your problems in Missouri are your problems, but just so you know, the job to prove that you are innocent of the charge of abolitionism, that's yours. You have a responsibility to deflect that. I can't do anything for you. Because in this republic, as he said, vox populi, vox Dei. The voice of the people is the voice of God. So if you get called an abolitionist, Mr. Phelps, that's your problem, not mine. Good luck. So for several years, and by several years, up until 1970 or so, progressive, or at least self-styled progressive Latter-day Saints, embraced an idea that was called the Missouri thesis. And that is that the priesthood restriction could be dated to the Latter-day Saints' persecution in Missouri. They're dealing with being called an abolitionist. They need to distance themselves from the African-American community, and therefore they offered to exclude African-Americans from the priesthood and from the church. Now, this is based in some truth. This isn't fabricated out of whole cloth. Not long after the expulsion from Jackson County, Missouri, W.W. Phelps, the editor of the Evening and Morning Star, which was the Latter-day Saint newspaper there, he said, okay, so I once told you that there was no special rule as pertains, the African-American community. Well, I was just kidding. What I meant was, we will not allow any African-Americans into our midst. We will exclude them entirely. We will essentially be a white church. And as a side note, I use the terms white and black because they were contemporary to the time. I fully respect and acknowledge Brother Perkins' fantastic work on this. So Phelps, he sought to do this as a kind of boxing maneuver. And this played into the thinking of many historians, saying, okay, this is where we got the idea that blacks should be excluded from the Latter-day Saint community. But there's a problem in that thesis. And that is that Latter-day Saint leadership came from a large coalition of thinkers. There were a variety of views when it came to issues regarding race. Let's just go one by one, just to give you a sense of how different Latter-day Saints viewed those of the African-American community. Parley P. Pratt, for example, wrote a history of the persecutions of the Latter-day Saints in Missouri in 1839 and 1840. He went out of his way to emphasize to all readers that the Latter-day Saints had such a minuscule number of African Americans amongst their membership that it was virtually negligible. You can dismiss it entirely. We are a white church. He wanted people to understand that. Orson Hyde made it clear to Joseph Smith that he was not comfortable with African Americans being emancipated from slavery and being allowed into the church as they had been. Zebedee Coltrane, he made clear his discomfort when he became acquainted with the first African American priesthood holder, Elijah Abels. W.W. Phelps, he had started out as something of an abolitionist, but then in 1834 he pulled a 180 and said, actually, we we want nothing to do with the African American community. And while in Utah, he in fact defended slavery. And then Reese Price, he's the radical of the bunch. I have a certain fondness for him. He joined the faith in Cincinnati in 1842, and he was a committed, ardent, and die-hard abolitionist. In 1850, when the census was enumerated, he identified himself, as far as his profession goes, as a theocrat. I am a professional theocrat. And then we have Elijah Abels. Who is this man? He's certainly one of the most important figures in understanding the history of the priesthood restriction, though hardly not the only important figure. He was baptized in Cincinnati in 1832, ordained to the priesthood in 1836. We have his priesthood certificate. This is not up for debate. He served a mission to Ontario, Canada in 1838, and ordained a man to the priesthood while there, and also had to dodge a tar and feather mob in the process. He returned to the main body of the Latter-day Saints, was ordained to 70 in 1841, and then moved back to Cincinnati the following year, where he served in the top-level leadership of the Cincinnati branch, and personally organized disciplinary hearings of white Latter-day Saints, and he was listened to as well as respected. Now, there were some issues where he was asked to primarily preach to the African-American population, but that comes as no surprise to us, primarily because, as we know from comments from Joseph Smith, he often said, well, let's send an Arab to Arabia, or let's send a Frenchman to France. He often believed that you should preach to your own ethnic group. So the fact that Elijah Abels was ordained to the priesthood, that problematizes the Missouri thesis somewhat, because he was ordained to the priesthood within a week of Joseph Smith releasing his statement calling blacks such horrible things and endorsing slavery. So you have Joseph Smith authorizing Elijah Abels' ordination 1 week, and then endorsing slavery and calling for the exclusion of blacks entirely from their community the next. But then we have the story of William McCary, and if Elijah Abels problematizes the narrative, William McCary throws a wrench into the narrative like most of us have never seen. So who was William McCary? He was a runaway slave, also a brilliant musician, very persuasive, very charismatic. He knew how to pull in an audience, and he eventually found his way into the Latter-day Saint communities. He had a certain fondness for the Latter-day Saint communities, and he often siphoned people from within the membership and created factions of his own. He arrives in winter quarters in spring of 1847, and he promptly marries a Caucasian girl by the name of Lucy Stanton, who was the daughter of a former stake president. Now, for those of you who know anything about interracial marriage and sexuality in the 19th century, this was a great example of playing with fire. William McCary, by being so willing to walk around with his white spouse, was asking for criticism at the very least, and in several instances it was not at all uncommon for an African-American man to lose his life over such an indiscretion. McCary makes a comment upon arriving in the winter quarters community and marrying his white wife. He says of the Latter-day Saints, "Some say there go the old N-word and his white wife," with clear disdain. Now, people remembered Joseph Smith, and they remembered that he had authorized the ordination of Elijah Abels. Further, they knew that Joseph Smith had a deep and abiding affection for Elijah Abels. This was a kind of friendship that endured for generations. They talked about it even long after Elijah's death, how good of a friend Elijah was to Joseph Smith and vice versa. So the Latter-day Saints remembered this, and they said, well, Joseph Smith was okay. He's passed on now, but we're really, really uneasy with this situation. And I provide this image for you because that is an original image of the meeting minutes that record him saying this. Of course, he's immediately ostracized. And the text says, today some of the sisters said that is the man that Brother Brigham tells his family to treat with disrespect. So certain members were saying, well, Brother McCary, yes, you found your way into our community, but just so you know, you're not welcome here. McCary approaches Brigham Young. He wants to see if the rumors are true. What does Brigham Young say? It's nothing to do with blood, for of one blood, quoting Acts 17:26, has God made all flesh. We have to repent and regain what we have lost. We have one of the best elders, an African in Lowell, a barber. Now, he drops a few names there and comments that do call for some unpacking, but the most important aspect of this quote is he specifically endorses African Americans holding the priesthood. Later on in the meeting, he would say, the color of your skin doesn't matter to us, Brother McCary. Isn't that right, gentlemen? And then all of the other gentlemen. This is a large number of other leaders, including people such as Heber C. Kimball, George Grant, other respected members of the community. They all say, aye, that's true. Color doesn't matter to us. March of 1847. And there is the image from which I drew that transcription. Mid-April, Brigham Young leaves for the Great Basin, leaving William McCary and his white wife basically to their own devices. Now, William McCary, in fairness, he did nothing to help the situation, because immediately after Brigham Young leaves, he begins to marry a series of other white women, practicing his own form of interracial polygamy. Now, you're already married to a white woman. You're already winning the disfavor of white Latter-day Saints. Why not just marry a few more and see what it takes to push them over the edge? Well, he succeeded, and a white mob congregated and essentially chased McCary, as one man recalled, to Missouri on a fast trot. His wife, Lucy, followed close behind. Now, that is not a depiction of the particular mob action. I have drawn this from another mob action that would have resembled what it looked like. So how do the Latter-day Saints respond once McCary and his wife have left? Well, we know something about Parley P. Pratt's views, based on his earlier history of the persecution of the Latter-day Saints. And it is Parley P. Pratt who gives us the very first evidence of the existence of a priesthood restriction. He gives it to us when Brigham Young is hundreds of miles away in the Great Basin. Latter-day Saints are pressuring Parley P. Pratt and Orson Hyde, saying, "How dare you? What business do you have?" Is it still on? Okay. What business do you have allowing a character like William McCary into our community? He's clearly a sexual predator. He's exactly what we would expect an African American to be like. And here you are, entertaining them. How dare you? So Parley P. Pratt said, well, of course that's going to happen. He has the blood of Ham in him. And those who are descended from the blood of Ham cannot hold the priesthood. Now notice what he said there. The blood of Ham. He didn't say the curse of Cain. And this is a point on which Parley P. Pratt and Brigham Young differed quite significantly. Brigham Young was insistent in later years that it was the curse of Cain. Parley P. Pratt believed it was the curse of Ham. Which is it? Already we're seeing that the foundations of the priesthood restriction are, as Sterling McMurrin said, shot through with ambiguity. So Brigham Young, he returns to winter quarters in December of 1847. He said this is the place. He's had the great experience of starting up the Mormon experiment in the West, and he's coming to see how matters are. And one of the first things he hears about is the William McCary incident. Now, when Brigham Young was telling William McCary that he supported McCary's involvement in the community, and in fact, he even supported McCary holding the priesthood, which he did. You know, he had been ordained by Orson Hyde himself. Brigham Young, though, he had a line. He believed that as much as it was acceptable for McCary to be a member of the community, and even as acceptable as it was for him to have a white wife, he didn't believe that there should ever be interracial offspring. It's one thing if two people want to get married, but once you start having children, then that is something that has an impact on the human family and ultimately the eternity, not to mention the priesthood. Here's what he said. Now, you'll notice I have identified different phrases by different colors, and there's a reason for that. So we'll read through the whole thing entirely. If they were far away from the Gentiles, they would all have to be killed. When they mingle, it is death to all. So the first line, Brigham Young is saying that an interracial couple is worthy of death, which is obviously quite violent rhetoric. It's the kind of thing that people actually did in some communities. They made good on that rhetoric when African Americans and Caucasians intermarried. But then he follows it up by saying, if a black man and a white woman come to you and demand baptism, can you deny them? So he goes from threatening death to expressing uncertainty. But then he says, the law is their seed shall not be amalgamated. Amalgamated was a long word for basically an interracial marriage, interracial sexuality. Mulattoes are like mules, they can't have children. Now, this sounds like ridiculous thought in the 21st century eye, or the 21st century ear. But in the 19th century, this was the thinking of some of the country's leading scientists. One named Josiah Nott was immensely influential in helping to write up the 1850 census. And he made it clear, once whites, Caucasians, and African Americans intermarry, then you might as well just say farewell to the human race. So Brigham Young was echoing thought that was pretty common for the time. But then he followed it up by saying, but if they will be eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake, they may have a place in the temple. So I've entitled the slide, A Conflicted Brigham Young, because he is a man of two minds. This incident has clearly caused him to ask some very hard questions of his own racial assumptions. He couldn't understand exactly what to do with this. He believed in African Americans holding the priesthood, but he simply could not abide interracial sexuality. But even at this point, he has not gone so far as to say that African Americans should not have the priesthood. He's still conflicted. In fact, he says, if they will be eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake, not have children, they may have a place in the temple. So between December of 1847 and January, February 1852, Brigham Young hardens his views on race. He gives two speeches in front of the Utah Territorial Legislature and says, not only are African Americans suffering from the curse of Cain, but they are also fit for manual servitude. And I therefore endorse slavery in this territory. To quote him exactly, I am a firm believer in slavery, unquote. Oh, he did believe that slavery should be a little bit different in Utah than it was in the South. You know, the slavery in the South, it was barbaric, it was exploitative. Slavery in Utah ought to be benevolent. You know, it ought to be focused on the uplift of the African American race. But never forget that there's a racial order, he said. There are those who are superior, and then there are those who are inferior. And for the rest of his life, he continued to iterate these views. And you never see again the comments that he made either in March of 1847 or some of the comments he made in December of 1847. He did continue to repeat his ideas that those who participated in interracial sexuality or marriage were in fact worthy of death. And it's noteworthy that when the Act in Relation to Service, which was the slave law in Utah, when that was passed, there was a code included in it, a proviso saying that there could be no sexuality between Caucasians and Africans. Now, it's worth noting that in the midst of these discussions, Brigham did not go unopposed. There was a voice who said, actually, Brigham, I think you're wrong. Now, by this point, to stand up to Brigham Young and say, you're wrong, it took somebody with a little bit of spine, a little bit of confidence. And that was none other than Orson Pratt. In January of 1852, in response to Brigham Young's first slavery speech, delivered on January 23rd, Orson Pratt said, 1, it is not our job to enforce the curse that is upon African Americans. Yes, they're cursed. We all know that. But that's not our business, not our problem. 2, there was no revelation on this, Brother Brigham. We've never heard the voice of the Lord telling us that we should endure slavery. Why are you doing it now? And Brigham Young promptly follows it up by saying, well, now that you mention it, the Lord has revealed it to me. And you can find a full text of the February 1852 speech, the one in which Brigham Young says that the Lord has revealed it to me, in the second half of my book, including a transcription of the original Pitman shorthand. And that's actually where we get the comments from Orson Pratt. That is thanks to the tremendous work of Legene Carruth, who is our Pitman shorthand specialist over at the Church History Library. Until she did research very recently, we had no idea that Orson Pratt had said these things. So what happens from 1852 over the course of the next generation? We see that this priesthood restriction that began all the way with Parley P. Pratt seeped into the Mormon consciousness, into Mormon society, and eventually became entrenched in the latter part of the 1870s as well as 1880s and 1890s. In 1879, Elijah Abels approaches the brethren and says, I would like to receive my endowment. I am to be a welding link between the white race and the black race. I need my endowment. And they turned him down out of hand after a little bit of discussion. But as far as they were concerned, they didn't even refer to him as Elijah Abels in the minutes. They referred to him as a man named Abel, as though he were some kind of stranger, though he was no stranger. Jane Manning James, she was denied her endowment in the 1880s and 1890s. And it was around this time that the idea of a premortal explanation for the priesthood restriction came into vogue. Now, as early as 1845, Orson Hyde had said, yes, African Americans were, in fact, not as valiant in the premortal life. They kind of had sympathies for the devil. But he never went so far to say that it was that it led to the priesthood restriction. But by now, that old line of thought was being applied to explain a priesthood restriction. So we have theology that is morphing over time. And we actually see that Brigham Young, he forcefully pushed back against this thesis. He said, those of you who say that has something to do with premortality, it has nothing to do with premortality. Nothing. It's the curse of Cain. And anyone who says otherwise is just wrong. And he was even willing to say this to his brother, Lorenzo. So we're seeing that the explanations to the priesthood restriction are still fraught with ambiguity. Even amongst top church leaders, they can't quite decide. Is it the premortal life? Is it the curse of Cain? Is it the curse of Ham? They never went so far as to say we don't really know, but you can see this clearly in the variety of records. So the second part of this presentation focuses on the theology of it. What does this mean for Latter-day Saint theology? And an important aspect of the story that gets overlooked is the relationship between the prophet and the people within the covenant community. When we talk about race and the priesthood and race and Mormonism, we fixate on what church leaders say. We look at all of the comments that they've made. We keep a catalog, and we have a list of everything Brigham Young's said that's offensive and racist, and we rightfully get upset about it. But that's but a small slice of the story at hand.
Hello guys, welcome back to the channel. I hope you're fine wherever you are today. As again, this is your presenter Jintic Stories, and I think it's important that the church should be involved in these discussions, because most of these people, the oppressors, they might not get this information, but when they go to church, because there is a big difference between being somebody who knows God and doing the opposite of what God would want you to do as your creator or as your maker. So it's important because sometimes the people who does this doesn't have this information. Maybe the families that these people come from, they don't have this information. So it starts with these social places. It starts with these places that they can go and they can be taught what to do or what not to do to other people. Also, I think that teaching people sensitivity in regards to other races, also making them appreciate other races, also comes in handy when it comes to understanding what other group of people goes through. And it's important to always take your time to look, to study what other races, to appreciate something that they have, right? So we are at a point where, regardless of where we are, because in the past the church used to mask a lot of things. The church used to hide the struggles. The church used to not talk about some things, considered that they were not appropriate talking about them in the church. But today I'm happy that I'm saying people are having these conversations. People are having these conversations which are difficult, right? And sometimes I understand the oppressor might not want to be confronted about these topics. Like literally, you're not the oppressor, but you are enjoying from the systems which were put by these people. Because somebody will argue that I understand that racism ended a long time ago, but what makes you an oppressor is you're not saying no. You're remaining silent in a situation of injustice, which makes you as an oppressor. Remaining silent in a situation of injustice is a complacent injustice. So you're not doing anything because you're remaining silent. You chose to remain silent because there is something that you're enjoying. And white people are not always ready to come out to talk about their white privilege. They won't just talk about it because they decide to remain silent. Maybe their parents, maybe your father, maybe your mother is there is a privilege that they are getting, but they can't share with you, right? So every white person has a privilege. Somehow, by default, there are chances that white people could get a lot of opportunities as compared to black people. So I would like to just know what you think about all this. Do you think that the preacher addressed this issue in the right way? I just want to know what you think about, all this, because it's always important to have these information. God himself, who created human being, doesn't support racism. God created you to respect, to live together with people in harmony, not to divide amongst ourselves, not to fight amongst ourselves. That's why they say that God's wrath will be on those people who are trying to do bad things to God's sons and daughters. I just want to know, what do you think about this video? I really want to know what you think about it. These are presented Jindok stories. I'm just asking you again, if you're watching this video for the first time, to subscribe to the channel, to join the membership, you can decide to buy me a coffee through my Cash App account. I'll definitely appreciate. Thank you so much. Peace, love, and harmony.